Hello, and welcome to Trinity Bible Media. This is the 6th episode in our Introduction to Genesis series. Last time we examined the origin and development of the most prominent critical attack on Mosaic authorship, known as either JEDP Theory or the documentary hypothesis. Today we'll begin to turn the tables and consider some of the problems with that theory. Now, if you're not familiar with JEDP, I do recommend that you go ahead and watch that previous video before diving into this one, since many of the concepts and terminology that we will discuss will have been introduced there. In today's episode, we'll consider a few of the problems with the theory as a whole, and then next time we'll begin to refute some of its specific claims. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'd like to take a look at has to do with loanwords. What's a loanword? Well, as I'm sure you know, different languages tend to swap words with one another. The English language, for example, has borrowed all sorts of words. Words like ballet, cabernet, Calvary, bayonet, and garage were all donated by the French. Kindergarten, loafer, noodle, lager, and Farfenugan all come from German. And bandana, bungalow, pajamas, shampoo, and thug come from Hindi. Well, ancient languages swap words too, and that includes Hebrew. And when language expert Benjamin Noonan studied all of the various non-Semitic loanwords in the Hebrew Bible, he found some very interesting facts. In case you were wondering, Semitic is the language family that Hebrew belongs to. In the numbers I'll share in just a sec, words originating from other languages in that same family are not included. We're only considering non-Semitic languages. In the Old Testament, the two primary non-Semitic donor languages are Egyptian and Old Iranian. What Noonan found was 36% of the non-Semitic loanwords in the whole Old Testament come from Egyptian, and 71% of the loanwords in just the Pentateuch are from that same language. So we have lots of Egyptian words in the Pentateuch. Percentage-wise, that's twice as many as the Old Testament as a whole. This higher concentration of Egyptian words in the Pentateuch is exactly what we would expect if it were written when the rest of the Bible says it was written, by Moses as the Israelites were leaving Egypt. And this is the opposite of what we would expect if the Pentateuch was written closer to the time of the exile, which is what the JEDP claims. Conversely, Old Iranian was a language spoken in Babylon during the exile, and so we would expect the Hebrew Bible to include some loanwords from it. Sure enough, 33% of the non-Semitic loanwords in the Hebrew Bible come from Old Iranian, which, if you will recall, is about the same as the number of Egyptian words. But here's the cool part. There are absolutely no Old Iranian loanwords used in the Pentateuch. None. Now, why is that? If a big chunk of the Pentateuch was written during that time, it stands to reason that at least some of those words would have slipped in. But they didn't. Why? Well, the Pentateuch was written many centuries before Old Iranian was even a thing. Both of these phenomena, the high usage of Egyptian words and the complete absence of Old Iranian words in the Pentateuch, present major problems to the JEDP notion. It is not at all consistent with what they propose, and there doesn't seem to be much of a rebuttal coming from that camp. The next problem for the theory that I'd like to point out has to do with the city of Jerusalem. You may remember from the last video that in 1805, Willem Martin Lebrecht de Witt claimed the Book of Deuteronomy was something that King Josiah and Hilkiah the high priest had cooked up, planted, and then discovered in the temple in order to abolish worship and sacrifice everywhere except Jerusalem. If they could pull that off, it would unify all of the tribes of the kingdom under King Josiah and ensure that all of the revenues would flow indirectly to the temple under Hilkiah. This is a major pillar of Wellhausen's fabricated theory of Israel's history. But here's the problem. Why isn't there a single mention of the conquest of Jerusalem or its future status as the center of Jewish worship and sacrifice? Wouldn't including something like that in their cooked-up propaganda have served them well? Wouldn't mentioning Jerusalem in the Lord's proclamations add credence to Josiah's scheme? Seems like a no-brainer to me, but there's not a single mention of Jerusalem by name. Sure, Mount Moriah is mentioned in Genesis 22 as the place where Abraham would sacrifice Isaac, but there's no indication it would be the location of the future temple. Genesis 14 tells us that Melchizedek is the king of Salem, which would later be called Jerusalem, but that's merely a passing reference to a historical place. Deuteronomy 12, 5 through 18 indicates that there would be a place where God would make his habitation and receive sacrifices, but there's no indication that that place would be Jerusalem. A key component of JEDP is that the book of Deuteronomy was propaganda intended to legitimize the goals of Josiah and Hilkiah by focusing the Jewish religion in Jerusalem. But the Pentateuch never once mentions Jerusalem by name and never once implies that Jerusalem will be the epicenter of Judaism. And there would be every incentive for them to do so. So leaving out Jerusalem just doesn't make any sense. And at least in my mind, it's another nail in the coffin of JEDP. Next, you may recall from the last episode that JEDP advocates make a really big deal out of God being referred to by different names. Well, let's look at one of those names. Depending on your translation, you may know it as Yahweh of hosts or more likely Lord of hosts. If you'd like, you can do a quick Bible search for the term and see how prominent it is. The ESV translation uses the title 230 times. According to these search results, it looks like it's used rather sparsely in the historical books and a few times in the Psalms. But look at the prophets. The term is used 49 times in Isaiah and 71 times in Jeremiah. In fact, it appears to be a very prominent title in those books. Lord of Hosts is referred to in 7 of the minor prophets, with the highest density looks like Zechariah and the 4 chapters of Malachi. So what's my point here? Well, JEDP claims that the Pentateuch was written from about 850 BC to 450 BC, which just happens to be the same time that all of these prophetic books were written. And so that happens to be the time frame within which all 230 instances of Lord of Hosts occur. And if this usage was so prominent in the prophetic books, we would expect it to at least make an appearance in the Pentateuch if the Pentateuch was written at the same time. But there is not a single reference to the Lord of Hosts in the Pentateuch. Not one. According to Gleason Archer, who is an expert in comparative literature, which is what we're talking about here, this is the strongest kind of evidence supporting the fact that the Pentateuch was written during a time when the title Lord of Hosts was not being used. In other words, the Pentateuch was not written during the mid-first millennium as the critics claim. Again, the facts just don't line up for JEDP. Next, let's talk for a moment about archaeology. Something that we have to keep in mind is that all of these supposed source documents are strictly theoretical. I'm sure you've already figured that out, but it's worth drawing our explicit attention to. No copies or fragments of anything resembling one of these documents has ever been found, nor are there any references to one of these documents in any known ancient text. So the world of archaeology lends absolutely no support to JEDP theory, but it does lend support to Mosaic authorship. Let me give you one example. According to the critics, the P document was written in the 5th century BC after the exile. It contains all of the priestly rites, instructions, things of that nature. Numbers 6, verses 24 and 25, which is the Lord's blessing of Aaron, is supposed to belong to this P document. Well, in 1979, 2 small silver scrolls were found at Ketef Hinnom, just outside Jerusalem, and those scrolls contain that passage. When the scrolls were paleographically dated, they were found to have originated in the late 7th or early 6th century BC, and those are the late or worst case estimates. Some experts have dated them to the 8th century BC. Any way you slice it, those scrolls were created before the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, or centuries before JEDP says that they would have been written. Again, we have another serious blow to the whole JEDP concept. It sounds respectable and scientific when you hear its advocates talk about it, but the facts on the ground simply don't allow for it. Here, I've just mentioned a few of the serious problems with JEDP, but I could have gone into many more. Gleason Archer, in his Old Testament introduction, as well as his Encyclopedia of Biblical Difficulties, mentions some of these and then goes into several others. Some of them are really detailed and esoteric, but they do provide pretty solid corroborating evidence that the Pentateuch originated when and where the rest of the Bible says it did. Scholars like John Albright and Kenneth Kitchen have studied the various archaeological discoveries and realized that the details of the patriarchal stories fit in very well with the historical context of the 2nd millennium BC, more so than the mid-first millennium. And other scholars like Edwin Yamauchi and Umberto Cassuto have thoroughly destroyed it from a textual perspective. At first glance, the theory seems sophisticated and scholarly, as if there may be substance behind it. But once you actually analyze it, you find that there is not much to see. It's patchwork, it's Frankensteinian, it's pseudoscientific, whatever you call it, it's clearly nonsense. It's supposed to be based on observations made from the text itself. Yet when these observations are demonstrated to be inconsistent with the facts, proponents of the view appeal to textual corruption, clumsy editors, or other forms of special pleading. In short, they begin with the conclusion and do whatever they have to do in order to get there. When we pick up next time, we're going to begin looking at some of the specific claims made by the theory, In fact, we'll look at the problem that got this whole mess started. The fact that the Pentateuch uses multiple names for God. I think it'll be a fun one, and it'll give us the opportunity to do some actual Bible study. I'm very excited about that. Between now and then, may God bless you.